Abraham's descendants became a great people. They were enslaved in Egypt. Yet God remembered his promise. He raised up Moses as a deliverer, parted the sea, and led them out of captivity into a promised land. God guided them through the wilderness and provided for every need. Even as they doubted and disobeyed, his presence never wavered. God pursued them, creating a holy nation set apart to reveal his glory to the world.
Morning, everyone. Oh, surprise. Just keeping you awake. The year was 2012. It was the summer between grade 11 and 12 for me, and I was about to go on a mission trip type thing with World Vision, a month in Rwanda, and the leader of our team gave us some questions to help prepare ourselves. And one of the questions that I was asked, I had no clue how to answer. It kind of stumped me. And the question was this. We were asked, what is the title of your story? Your life, your particular season? What would you title it? What would you call it? A word, a phrase? I could settle for a haiku. And I didn't know how to answer that. And if I asked you to think about it right now, you might also have to chew on it a little bit. But I would encourage you to keep this in the back of your mind as we step into the story of Exodus today. The word Exodus literally means the road out. Exodus. You hear the word ex nihilo, how God makes out of nothing. The word Exodus means the road out. And this is the title that's been given to the story of God's people at this time, and it's very much symbolic of the story of all of God's people for all of time. And we're going to be looking at this story today, this road. If this is a road out, what's the road for? What's the purpose of it? Where is it going? Also, what is the terrain of this road? What's it actually like? And who are the people on this road? Who are the people that God likes to use? So I would invite with you to turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 1. We're going to be in chapters 1 and 2 today, kind of introducing some of the big themes that we're going to see throughout this whole book. And as we're going through these, we finished Genesis last week and we're stepping into Exodus now. If you go to our website, bayviewglen.org/thepursuit, we have a whole page of resources of ways to supplement you and your study, because there's far more things to be seen and savored in God's Word than we could ever cover in 30 minutes once a week. So also keep that in your mind as we go. We just finished Genesis. In the beginning of Exodus, it kind of gives us this bit of a transition verse to remind us of what happened and what's coming. So in verses 6 to 7, the author says this: Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So at the end of Genesis, we see God resolving a lot of these conflicts that we're building, and also how he's being faithful to his covenant to these people. He comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. They didn't even have any kids. And we see a family line grow. And now we see that of around the 70 of Joseph and Jacob and the family that went to Egypt, now they've grown into a great nation. And this is also an echo of Genesis 1:28 when God says, be fruitful and multiply. These people are being blessed by God. They are being fruitful. They are multiplying. And Pharaoh was not a fan. He saw this number of people growing. It was a distinct ethnic and cultural entity within the nation of Egypt that was growing, and he saw it as a potential threat. It says in chapter 1 that if a war broke out and Israel joined with the enemies of Egypt, that would be a problem. So he's going to try and neutralize this threat a bit. And the first way that he does this in chapter 1 is through slavery. They enslave the Hebrews, forced labor. And that doesn't seem to quite do the trick. It's not solving the problem, because in verses 12 to 14, it says this: But the more they were oppressed, God's people, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the fields. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. If you're familiar with the story of Exodus, you know this. If you've seen the movies, you know this. What's unfortunate about English translations is that in these verses, we actually see the main theme, if not one of the main themes of Exodus, right in front of us, but our English translations have to gloss over it. They kind of have to hide it and mute it a little bit. Because in verse 14, it says this, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. That word for service, it's the Hebrew word avad. And it does mean serving and working, but it refers to the way of serving as if serving a master. It's that type of service. And we don't have an English equivalent. But if we used the word avad, literally, if we translated this literally, verse 14 would look like this. They made their lives bitter with serving and brick and mortar. And with every kind of serving, they made them serve. I'll read that again. They made their lives bitter with serving and brick and mortar. And with every kind of serving, they made them serve. So this is one of the themes that we see here. It's this type of serving. And what we're going to see throughout the whole book of Exodus is simply this point. If you serve anything or anyone but God, you are a slave. It's a bold statement. We're going to see it unfolded throughout the whole book. Because when Moses goes to Pharaoh 9 or 10 times speaking on behalf of God, he does not say, let my people go. Charlton Heston said that, and DreamWorks said that. Yeah. But it's more. Moses is speaking on behalf of God, and he says, let my people go so that they may serve me. Let my people go out into the desert to worship me. Let them go into the desert to make sacrifices unto me. He's saying, let them go for these purposes. So the book of Exodus, it's this. It starts in slavery and ends in worship. Why does that matter? Well, if you're reading the book of Exodus, normally we kind of get stuck and bogged down in the middle of it, because the start of Exodus, it's fantastic. It's fast-paced, it's moving, there's actions, there's miracles and pillars of fire and bushes on fire and snakes and staffs. It's a great time. And then you get to the halfway point and it starts feeling dull. It's just talking about pages and pages of the dimensions of the tabernacle and the pillars and the design of the veil outside the Holy of Holies. And you're probably looking at this thinking, they're not going to put this in the movie. And you're right, but you missed the purpose of the book of Exodus. It starts in slavery and ends in worship. When God is delivering his people, it's not just so that they're out of slavery and he goes, all right, I've delivered you. Now go have fun for like 60 years and then you'll pass away and I'll see you in heaven. Peace out. It doesn't say that at all. But God saves his people so they can serve the true Lord. He doesn't serve them so they can have no Lord. God saves his people so they can serve the true Lord. And this is very much a contradiction, and it's a correction to our contemporary understanding of freedom. We understanding of freedom as having nothing over me, nothing above me, nothing imposing on who I am and what I want to do. Freedom means being able to do what I want. And that is true in a political and civic sense, that nations should promote and protect the freedoms and rights of their citizens, 100%. But it's incomplete on a personal and spiritual level. Because if I am free, well, what is my freedom for? You're always free from something, and you're free for something or someone. You're always free for someone. So the Exodus at the beginning, we're kind of seeing this fork in the road of choose wisely. What are you going to serve? Who are you going to serve? And there's this invitation to serve the God who knows you, who loves you, and who is faithful to his covenants. And this, I can see you're frowning. Maybe you're tired, but maybe you're confused. This still feels strange. You might think, okay, Pastor, I don't feel like a slave. I know you're saying these things and it lines up with the story well, but I don't feel like a slave. Consider the following, very briefly. Everybody lives for something. Humans are goal-oriented creatures. It's impossible not to. So there's something in our lives, explicitly or implicitly, you might not even be aware of it, and this is the thing that you're working towards. This is the goal. This is what it means to be a good person. This is my security. If I have this, then I feel stable. I feel secure. Maybe I can look myself in the mirror. Maybe it's if I have some financial stability. Maybe it's my career. If my career is going well and I'm advancing well, things are going well in that respect. Maybe it's just your own self-respect. I'm a good person. I want to be a good person. Maybe it's your family. But we all have something, and this is what we work towards. This is kind of the basis of our identity. And everything is good if this is good. But if this is threatened, if this thing is touched, if this thing is challenged, then I feel anxious. I feel like I'm losing control. So if you want to know what this thing is for you, what's the thing in your life that if this started to get shooken up a little bit, you would feel equally shaken? What is that thing that you are tied to? We're all serving something. And what we're going to see here is that when you're serving the living God, there's freedom that comes with it. So it's not if you serve, but what. And there is freedom here. 2 Peter 2:19 echoes this. It says, "For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. And anything you center your life on besides God will make you a slave." This is just in passing. In Genesis 3, we talked about this for the whole message, with the knowledge of good and evil. But consider a contemporary illustration. Imagine a pastor, a husband is trying to bless his wife. And he wants to get everything great for when she comes home from work. So first, deep clean of the house. Dishes, going to take care of the floors, going to make the beds, going to do the laundry, take care of that. Next, going to prepare a nice meal. So I'm going out and buying a good steak, her favorite flowers, her favorite wine, maybe some cheesecake, come back home, hot bath ready for when she comes back. I'm going to meal prep so she doesn't have to make lunch for the next day when she comes home. I'm going to put on her favorite show. And after all that, I'm going to clear the schedule, and we're going to sit down and talk about her feelings. Best activity. My wife's taking notes. All right, Wednesday, here we come. Shouldn't have done that. Now, when this person is preparing it all, one of his buddies calls him up and says, "Hey, man, you want to play soccer tonight?" "I can't, because I'm doing this for my wife, and I'm doing this and this and this." And he says, "Oh, man, you're serving your wife in all these ways? You seem pretty oppressed." You would say, "No, dummy. I'm not oppressed. This is life-giving. It's my joy to do all of this for her." Or a couple years down the line, you got some kids, you got some rugrats running around the house, and your old buddies say, "Man, you're serving your wife, you're serving your family. You seem so oppressed. You don't have time for us anymore." You'd say, I'm not oppressed. It's no burden to serve my family. You are serving something. Some types of service lead to freedom in life. It's for freedom you've been set free. And some types lead to your bondage and enslavement. So if we're on this path, this road out, God frees us from slavery for worship. He will free you from serving these false gods that don't know you and don't love you. They use you and abuse you. And he's freeing you for himself. That's the purpose of the road. You're being taken from this for this. That's the first thing that we see. The second thing that we see in this introduction to Genesis is kind of the terrain of the road. What is this road like? If God has me on this road, if he has his people on this road out, what's it actually like? And the second thing that we see is that God works behind the scenes in hard and terrible times. We saw this all over in Genesis, but we see it right away in Exodus 2. Maybe it's because we still need to know it. But in the first 2 chapters of Exodus, God is hardly mentioned, and things keep going from bad to worse. And this is a beautiful rhetorical device because it kind of shows how we feel when things keep going from bad to worse. We're thinking, well, God can't be in this. When God's people are being enslaved, when the Egyptians come up literally with shackles and are beating them and enslaving them, and nothing happens. And I think that would be a great time for some divine intervention. Pillar of fire, army of frogs, but nothing happens. And things keep going from bad to worse. But what we'll see here in these 2 chapters is that these events that seem to stop and thwart God's purposes are actually the very things used to accomplish them. Because Pharaoh orders for all the Israelites to be enslaved, and they keep growing in numbers. So what we see in these chapters is that he comes to the midwives and says to them, "Okay, if any Hebrew boys are born, I want you to get rid of them, kill them, toss them in the Nile. Slavery isn't working. Let's move to genocide. He wants to wipe out a generation of Hebrew males. Also, maybe assuming that the Hebrew women would intermarry or be servants to the Egyptians, so he gets some ethnic reduction and some cultural dilution. This will help keep it down. And what happens? Moses is put in a basket by his mother, put down into the Nile, and he drifts to the place where the daughters of Pharaoh go to bathe. And Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter into the royal household. And Moses' birth mother is brought on to be the nurse of Moses. So what do you get? You get Moses still being raised by his mother. He's still retaining his Hebrew ethnic identity, but he's also in the courts of Pharaoh, where he would receive the best education. He learns their language, he learns their customs, he might have been trained in their tactics of leadership and military. And if you wanted to liberate the Hebrew people from Egypt, this would be the perfect person for it. Fully Hebrew, but fully educated and trained. Seems like things are getting better. There's a chance for liberation, and then things take a turn for the worse again. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 to 15, this is what happens when Moses is now growing up in Egypt. It says, one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Uh-oh. Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So he screws up terribly. He screws up royally. He's out. He sees an Egyptian, probably taskmaster, beating one of his people. Moses kills the Egyptian, tries to hide the body. Things get found out. And so the person who was placed to be the liberator of God's people is now banished from Egypt. Well, he's not banished. He fled because he has a death sentence on his head. So what can he do now? He's no good in Midian. How's God still going to redeem his people? And it's interesting that in the desert, this is where God continues to prepare him and train him for service. In Numbers 12:3, it says that Moses was the humblest man on the face of the earth. The humblest man on the face of the earth. That is the one thing he would not have learned in the courts of Egypt. He would not have learned humility. He would have learned quite the exact opposite. So even in the desert, God is preparing him not just to be any old leader, but the leader and deliverer of his people. That God is preparing his character. And in chapter 3, with the burning bush, God will send him back in. But God is working not just behind the scenes and trying to bring things back to zero, but in all of these circumstances, he is preparing the very person for his purposes through all of the decrees of Pharaoh in this way. So we simply see for us today that when God seems absent, he's not. He seems absent, but he's not. We only see him mentioned twice, but kind of with our whole series in Esther, we see his fingerprints. We see how things are lining up and connecting dots. And this still doesn't, sometimes it's comforting, sometimes it isn't. Because from my perspective, I still don't see how this would work out. If I had to articulate my thought process, this is how I would do it. Premise 1. I can't see any good reason for this. That's premise 1. Premise 2, if I can't see any good reason for this, then there can't be a good reason for this. Therefore, premise 3, therefore, there can't be a good reason for this. It's a tight argument, modus ponens, it's good, logically, but it's the second premise. Can you jump back one, Ashish? If I can't see any good reason for this, then there can't be one. And that's where it's challenging, because that's what I feel, but that's also gently being massaged and expanded by God. In all of these stories, we see this all through Genesis. We see this in Exodus as well, that they can't see it in this moment. And if all you have to base your life on and your freedom and your hope for the future is these things in your present, your capacity, your safety, your comfort, your network, your net worth, then yeah, you're in trouble. But if there is someone and something greater working through all of these, then you're not subject to your circumstances. You're subject to the one whom your circumstances are subject to. And that's something you can rest in, even in the pain. Even in the pain. That's the second thing we see on this road that God has his people on and us on as well, that we're freed from slavery for worship. But the terrain of this road, it's often hard and difficult times. Suffering, the Christian is no stranger to it. In 2 Peter, he says that actually Christians might expect more hardship for following Christ, not the opposite. But we already see God working behind the things. He works in hard seasons for his purposes and our good. These are not in opposition to each other. And thirdly, so we've seen the direction of the road, the terrain of the road. What kinds of people are on this road? Who does God like to work with and through? Well, we see this, that God works not through the weak, God works through the weak and the powerless, not through the strong and the powerful. We saw that all through the book of Genesis, that God works through the outsiders. It seems to be his style of choice. He works through the outsiders, not the insiders. He works through the younger brother, not the older. He works through the older woman, the barren woman, the unloved woman, not the younger and favored one. Here's a couple examples in Genesis. We see God working through Abel, not Cain, Isaac, not Ishmael, Jacob, not Esau, Rebekah, not Leah, Hagar, not Rachel. Who wrote this? That was me. Sorry, I got lost. But God likes to work through the outsiders, and we see this in chapters 1 and 2 as well. Consider in Genesis 1 and 2, who are all the heroes? It's all women. The men screw it all up. There's two guys talked about, Pharaoh and Moses. One is a genocidal dictator, and one is just kind of stupid and imprudent. And it's the women who are helping to accomplish God's purposes. Pharaoh comes to the midwives and says, I want you to kill every new Hebrew son that is born. And they don't do it. And they make up an excuse. They say, hey, these Hebrew women, they're pretty, just popping the babies out. We arrive and the kids are already born. They're already walking and talking. They got social insurance numbers. We can't stop them in this way. So they're doing creative and active and deliberate social disobedience. And it's assumed that these are actually not Hebrew women. These are Egyptian women. God blesses them with children. He blesses those who bless them. Now, why is this interesting? Well, first of all, women are second-class citizens in most of the ancient world. And some cultural anthropologists assume that the midwives were women who could not bear children. So you're a second-class citizen. And if you can't have kids, you were at best seen to be defective, and at worst, you were seen to be cursed by the gods. So these were second class in their gender, second class in their socioeconomic status, and they are the ones who were protecting and preserving the very person that would deliver God's people. And then the mother of Moses, she also takes Moses, and Pharaoh says to cast the boys onto the Nile. She does, but she puts them in a basket, and he drifts down the river to Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter, a Gentile woman, chooses to adopt this Hebrew boy. Dad says kill them all, and she chooses to adopt one. That would also have been some outright defiance in the most powerful person in the nation. And it's through these people that God is protecting, preserving, and raising up the deliverer for all of his people here today. So, for you here today, if you feel like, yes, I know that God likes to work through people, but I'm not intelligent, I don't have any means, I'm not very gifted, I feel like I can just be the cheerleader for the real Christians that go out there and get stuff done, but God can't really use me. The good news is this: you seem to be God's favorite. You seem to be his preferred people to work through, actually. You seem to be favorite vessels of his grace and his ability, that he says, yes, you have nothing, I have everything. Now watch what I'm going to do through you. So if you feel like you're an underdog, that you're an outcast, God has a special place for you in his plans. That's what we see here. We'll see this throughout Genesis, Exodus. You see this throughout the whole Bible. And for the rest of us believers, we talked about this at Christmas, But this is part of our motivation for why we go out as Christians to the outcast, to the vulnerable, to the impoverished, to the marginalized, and to the downtrodden. Because we have the same heart that God has for these people, that these people are recipients of God's love and his grace, regardless of anything they can do, and we're practicing this same posture with them. So this is encouragement for you if you feel like your time is past. You're just going out to the field now, waiting out your last couple years, or you have no skills, or you've messed up too much. We see God working through these people, and if he works through them, he can work through you. And this is also an invitation for us to go to them. Now, if we finished the sermon here today, you would not be blessed. This would actually be a bit of a burden just to tell you these principles and send you home. So wake up now. This is a good time if you want to hear something. It's useless just to tell you some nice principles and send you home. Because how can we model the life of Moses, model the life of God's people, the people of Israel, without knowing the God of Moses and the God of these people? Because there was a God who was at work in and through Moses. And there's also someone that Moses was looking towards as the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate redeemer. Consider the following. Just listen to this story and sounds familiar. There's a king, and he gives a decree to kill all the firstborn sons. But a child survives. This child rose up to liberate his people. He was rejected by his own people, actually. He went out to the desert and was anointed with God's Spirit and returned to deliver them, all the while under a sentence of death and condemnation. But this very sentence of death was the thing that raised him up to be the liberator of his people. Does that sound familiar? It's the story of Moses, and it's the story of Jesus. Jesus is the greater Moses. He is the one who gives the true deliverance. Maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you think I'm just lining up these convenient overlaps. Consider Luke 9. In the Transfiguration, in Luke 9, verses 28 to 31, it says this. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. That word for departure, it's very, very unique. You don't see it much. It is the Greek word for exodus. Jesus is referring to what he is about to do in Jerusalem as the same thing, the continuation, the fulfillment of what Moses did in Egypt. He is going to lead the greatest exodus, not just physically of one people group, but for all people of all time. Jesus is the Moses that Moses was looking towards, the true Moses who delivers his people. So if you want to follow in these footsteps, follow in this path, but you don't know Jesus, you're just going to be burdened. But in Jesus, you can really serve him and be free. You can really trust God, and you can really work for justice in this world. Here's how. Well, if you're on this road and you're trying to be free from these things and you want to serve God, but you don't know Jesus, you're just trying to be perfect on your own strength. I'm going to try and serve him. I'm going to try and do these right things, but I don't know if it's good enough, and some days I screw up, so maybe I need to take a step back and clean myself up and get my sins together, and then I can go back and serve God again. And you're always bound by your own abilities and your own imperfections. But with Jesus, if you're marked by his perfection, then you're free. I'm free. I'm free to serve God because I love him, not because I'm trying to earn anything, but because I have everything. That's one. 2, in your suffering. If you just know that God works all things together for good, that doesn't really give you peace. The best you can have is stoicism. All you can do is sit in the midst of it, and you can knuckle down, you can grit your teeth and just try and take it and tell yourself it's for a good purpose. And I may not see it now, I may never see it, but God is at work through it. But that doesn't help you in the moment. You have a head and a heart. But if I see in the person of Jesus that God was present in the worst thing to bring about the greatest good, and that Jesus suffered the greatest abandonment, then I can know in my suffering that I will never be alone. Hebrews 11 says that we have an empathetic high priest who knows what it was to suffer in every way. So I don't just get a principle, I get a person I get him in my suffering because he knows what it's like to be outcast, to suffer wrongly, to be failed at every level of justice. And thirdly, when it comes to one, trusting that God can use me, and two, even for Christians as we're trying to do good things in the world. How do you not get burnt out by doing good? You're trying to serve people who can do nothing for you. Sometimes they circle back to their old ways. Sometimes there's just bureaucracy and inefficiency, and it feels like I can't actually fix anything. How do you not get burnt out and jaded and bitter and cynical when you're trying to do these things? Well, I can rest in the fact that God will redeem all things, that he is at work through it, that it's his Spirit that's going forth, and I'm just joining him in this. I'm not responsible for the outcomes. I'm called to be faithful to where he's placed me. So I can trust that he is the one in all things, through all things, and he has promised and secured the victory to redeem all things. So that's my motivation for serving selflessly, because I'm not tied to it, and also for trusting that you are good enough. So we've been trying to answer this question today. It was really just introduced at the start. I asked you, what is the title of your story? We saw at the beginning of Exodus, the beginning of the story of God's people, this road that he has them on from slavery to worship. And the terrain of the road is suffering, seems to be par for the course, but that the people on this road are the outcasts, those who aren't good enough, and those are the ones whom God uses for his purpose. So I would invite you, let's pray. Would you close your eyes with me? Would you take a moment and reflect on your own self-understanding of your own life? What's the story that you tell yourself? This journey that you're on, this road. And do you see God in it? Is he in it? Is there a place where you could say, yes, this is the place where he first delivered me and he's calling me out? Are there things he's still trying to deliver you from? Where's the invitation today from God for greater freedom? Where's this place for trust in the midst of it? And in the midst of our suffering and these hard seasons, where is the place that we can trust that he is working through all things? Not that we can see it at all, but through the presence of his Son, we can know that he's with us, that we are not alone. And we see these stories again and again and again of how God works in greater ways than we could ever fathom or imagine. Is that in the story that we're telling ourselves? Is our story marked by his story? And finally, for those of us today who feel like we are nobodies, we're screwed up, we're outcasts, or for those of us who are called to these people, where has the resurrection of Christ not fully sanctified how you see yourself versus how God sees you, who he says that you are? Would today be a moment where we are invited into this story again? Just ask God to remind us of who we are, that he is far greater than anything that enslaves us, any season that we're in, and any story we may tell ourselves. And Father, as we continue to study your word, we know that we read it, but that it reads us as well. And so would you just give us greater eyes to see, but also hearts to trust and follow and believe that you are the God that does free us. You call us into greater life, the abundant life that is found only through the person and work of your Son. Would there be greater freedom here today? We ask all this in your Son's name.